Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wallace here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm an evolutionary epidemiologist with the People's CDC, here with an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the second of our two parts for this episode. In the first part, we covered the latest in global COVID, US COVID, and research in long COVID. Here in the second part, we'll continue to track the disintegration of US public health, not only through the specifics of the COVID response, but to the very notion of a public health commons. If you recall, in the first part of the episode, we read posts from Americans who detailed their COVID infections this past month. So, for instance, COVID positive, fully vaccinated, and up on all my boosters, plus an extra from when I was pregnant. I'm on day 5, and my fever finally broke today. I'm fully vaccinated and have all my boosters plus an extra. I have to have one while pregnant. I can honestly say having COVID feels like death. The worst headache is in my life, and I suffer migraines. Nausea, vomiting, shortness of breath, heart palpitations, full body aches, elevated heart rate even at rest, end quote. Now, unfortunately, I've had to add my own testimonial. I was an early adapter, first getting sick in March 2020. 3.5 years later, I got sick again mid-September. Days on headache, super sore throat, chills, body aches, many of the symptoms that we've been reading from other Americans. Now, I scored some Paxlovid, which helped in the short term, but suffered a bit of symptomatic rebound. I've still got some lingering symptoms, which puts me in the mid-COVID zone at this point, if for milder conditions than for many other millions of Americans. But I certainly appreciate the rage and disappointment of many of the posts we've been reading. The American people have been abandoned on COVID, gaslighted back into work as if SARS-CoV-2 wasn't a biosafety lab level 3 virus, still infecting hundreds of thousands a day to the disability of millions of Americans. It's no fun becoming what one reports on, but the prevalence of the pathogen is so widespread, the virus so infectious, that even those of us taking precautions can still get infected. Perhaps because even we too had momentarily left our guard down. Our efforts to get people to mask up or shelter in doesn't curtail our own desire. All this went away, or the fulfillment we all find in being with other people. Other researchers have gotten infected into their own long COVID. These include big cheeses who minimize the infection to one extent or another. University of Minnesota infectious disease guru Mike Osterholm first championed a strong public health response before backpedaling once the Biden administration took the Trump route on COVID. Characteristically, Osterholm went public with his long COVID before backpedaling on its impact. Washington Post columnist and former Baltimore Health Commissioner Leana Wen has championed abandoning the public health response to COVID since 2020. In 2022, she encouraged people to return to work with COVID to prevent staff shortages and to prevent negative implications for the economy, end quote. There couldn't be a clearer illustration of establishment public health serving employers first. In September, she characteristically denied the long COVID she contracted this summer as a long pneumonia. Now, such denialism continues to play out as the order of the Public Health Day. The whole "we have the tools" shtick to returning us back to 2019 as if COVID was some kind of cold virus has been routinely debunked by the half-assed nature of these pharmaceutical tools. The vaccines and drugs are helpful, but they are not enough, especially if they merely serve as an excuse to shutter prevention campaigns and, without public health prevention, shuttle millions into long COVID. With the community testing sites closed up, Americans are relying on the less precise home rapid antigen tests. As we've discussed in COVID this week before, these tests don't detect the fast-evolving spike protein. But that doesn't mean the nucleocapsid protein it does test for doesn't also evolve. One such test was discontinued for missing such evolution, but new explanations are being forwarded for delays in detection these days. Immunologist Michael Mina, chief science officer for EMED and an early proponent of the rapid tests, argues that because most people have been previously infected, their immune systems kick in earlier, producing symptoms earlier in the viral cycle. So people feel sicker while their viral loads are still too low to be detected by the rapid test. Multiple testing might be the answer. certainly to the testing market's profit. But another possibility is to reinstitute community PCR testing, which, more precise, would turn around a positive result faster than the at-home test. The faulty testing regimen here is particularly problematic as most doctors are adhering to a 5-day window between first symptoms and starting a Paxlovid prescription. Some of those doctors also expect a positive COVID test. By a combo of being cognizant of how short that window was, the luck of getting a positive rapid test, and being part of a medical group that has swiftly streamlined its COVID to Paxlovid pipeline, I was able to secure my prescription. But depending where one is in the country and how far away the nearest pharmacy is, Paxlovid is not always easily available. Friends who picked up my subscription had trouble finding Paxlovid upon their own infections and had to circle back to my pharmacy. The Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response offers a map of locations across the country that carry Paxlovid with a running count of doses available. You can find the link to their website in the video description. Now, much as it did for its COVID vaccines, Pfizer will now be offering Paxlovid only under market pricing after the federal government had until now made it free to the American people. A 5-day course would now cost nearly $1,400. Hardly something the nearly 28 million Americans without insurance can pay for, or the millions more underinsured whose carriers may choose not to pick up the bill. The Department of Health and Human Services championed the deal along the lines that Pfizer will continue to supply Medicaid and Medicare patients with free Paxlovid through 2024, and that Pfizer will continue to stock HHS's supply through 2028. But there's no doubt that COVID outcomes are now a matter of the market. Can you afford it? Will your insurance middleman cover your doctor's prescription? Because the markup is astounding. A January analysis by researchers Melissa Barber and Zontars Gotham estimated the cost of production for a 5-day course of protease inhibitors nirmatrelvir and ritonavir, the two drugs that comprise Paxlovid, came in at $13.38, with generic pricing, including 10% profit margin and 26% tax, at $15.08 per 5-day course. So Pfizer is aiming, when we're at $1,400 a pop, Pfizer is aiming for a 10,000% plus increase from the cost of production to the sticker price. COVID this week has long been reporting on the likelihood SARS-2 is evolving out from underneath natural immunity and these kinds of pharmaceuticals. The kind of market-driven constriction on their use will likely offer the worst of both worlds. People getting sick when they don't have to, and the balance of millions of susceptibles up against millions of patients taking the antivirals, permitting the virus, both the selection pressure to evolve resistance and the susceptibles to spill over. Now, we've repeatedly reported the beginnings of resistance to Paxlovid. Here, The Guardian reports work published in Nature showing the virus can evolve resistance to ribonucleoside molnupiravir before passing on to the next susceptible. The more a country used molnupiravir, the more resistance mutations were detected. Meanwhile, Oxford University's panoramic trial found molnupiravir didn't reduce hospitalization or death from Omicron among vaccinated high-risk patients. It did, however, speed up recovery time, which drug manufacturer MSD argued should reduce subsequent transmission. On the vaccine front, Novavax is introducing a new vaccine that is reported to be as effective as mRNA vaccines in preventing hospitalization and transmission. It's wider in the expanse of variants it covers, and there are fewer immediate side effects and bad outcomes like myocarditis. The vaccine is unlike the mRNA vaccines in that it's a more traditional protein-based inoculation with a new adjuvant matrix M developed from Chilean soapbark trees that further stimulate the immune system. Other vaccines are in the pipeline. An Ohio State University team developed a trivalent measles, mumps, SARS-CoV-2 spike S protein, or MMS vaccine candidate that induced robust systemic and mucosal immunity with broad protection across SARS-2 variants of concern. Well, in the mice, they tested anyway. That's an important caveat. And we see here for the figures B through D, high levels of spike-specific immunoglobulin G produced in mice for the monovalent and trivalent versions of the vaccine up to 7 weeks post-inoculation against 3 variants of concern: the early Washington State strain from 2020, the Delta variant, and Omicron BA1. We see the same for immunoglobulin A in diagrams E through G, and we see neutralization assays in figure H doing well against sera-epitopes for the D614G amino acid replacement that causes so much trouble in those who are infected, but as well Delta, BA1, and BA45, at least for the trivalent vaccine. In favor of this approach, the MMR backbone used here has a 50-year safety track record and a line of production already long set up. But what's the point of vaccine efficaciousness if its effectiveness sucks? That is, what if the federal government won't act to get the vaccines into people's arms? COVID train spotter Gregory Travis reported an Indiana pharmacy wouldn't provide he and his son the new monovalent booster because his Obamacare insurance no longer covered the COVID vaccination, despite federal stipulations that insurance companies must cover it. So if people who wish to get the vaccination are having problems, imagine the millions who are just shrugging their shoulders. Reuters reports that while 18% of Americans took the bivalent vaccine offered last year, less than 3% have taken the new monovalent targeted against the XBB 1.5 lineage. And that's the problem with taking an individualized approach to public health. Combine declaring the pandemic over and you do you, and leave it to one pharmacy to the next to drum up interest, as we have reported in previous episodes was the federal game plan, and the U.S. is left vulnerable. Ironically, Bloomberg columnist F.D. Flam argues here for even less vaccination. I mean, yeah, she's right. The seasonal approach is late in hitting the now little circulating XBB 1.5, but her notion that the vaccine should be given only to those most vulnerable misses 2 important points. First, we protect the vulnerable by making all of us less likely to pass on the virus. The vaccine isn't just about individual treatment. It's a public health approach. Second, who's vulnerable isn't always clear. Beyond the elderly and the immunocompromised, many learn they are vulnerable only upon their infection, regardless of their health or age. Otherwise, we encourage just the kind of internal ableism that Leanna Wen represents, in which those who suffer from the worst of COVID are encouraged to pretend they can't possibly be suffering. Indeed, new work shows vaccines help with long COVID even after infection. A Canadian team showed decreases in the number of symptoms and organ systems affected, and increases in the WHO well-being score in those first 3 graphs in the upper left. They also showed decreases in inflammatory markers, as shown in the upper 8 graphs on the right. But it isn't merely a matter of half-assed public health campaigns designed more for plausible deniability and profiteering. Emblematic of the political choices Americans are offered, some public health officials on the right are recommending their constituencies avoid vaccination. Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo advised people stay clear of the updated booster vaccine for COVID-19. There's a new vaccine that's coming around the corner, a new mRNA COVID-19 vaccine, and there's essentially no evidence for it, Ladapo said at a Jacksonville news conference with Governor Ron DeSantis. There's been no clinical trial done in human beings showing that it benefits people, Ladapo said. There's been no clinical trial showing that it's a safe product for people. And not only that, but then there are a lot of red flags, Ladapo continued. Ladapo warned that the updated vaccines actually cause cardiac injury in many people, end quote. Now, all of these declarations are factually incorrect. The vaccines reduce likelihood of being hospitalized or killed by COVID. And one is much, much more likely to suffer cardiac damage from the virus itself. But these statements speak to the continuing collapse of the very concept of public health in the U.S. 2 weeks later, Florida led all U.S. states in hospitalizations per 100,000. So it really speaks to what that leadership is helping or dealing to the people of Florida. Perhaps Greek in its drama and tragedy, the two politically permissible positions on public health are played out on the field. Jets quarterback and anti-vaxxer Aaron Rodgers slammed Kansas City Chief tight end Travis Kelce as Mr. Pfizer for his vaccine commercial. But Kelce was swift to remark, now you saw what I did there, right? His pride in helping save so many from COVID, as well as on the irony of Rodgers taking millions from Team Johnson & Johnson by bad-mouthing vaccines. The New York Jets are owned by Robert Wood Johnson of the Johnson & Johnson pharmaceutical family. Now, the discussion kept off the field entirely is represented by former San Francisco quarterback Colin Kaepernick, blackballed out of the NFL for his Black Lives Matter protests on the field. In April 2020, within a month of SARS-2's obvious destruction stateside, Kaepernick donated $100,000 under his Know Your Rights campaign as his foundation for coronavirus relief for Black and Brown communities who, quote, are being disproportionately devastated by COVID-19 because of hundreds of years of structural racism, end quote. That is, pandemic control extends far beyond the pharmaceuticals developed and to the underlying socio-historical landscape driving transmission dynamics. Instead, the U.S. seems to be devolving in the other direction. The virus continues to plow through people, but as R.E.G. Chakravarti and Martha Nelson describe, establishment public health officials describe the virus as if it's just a state of mind. I mean, talk about abandoning material reality for the logic of fantasy, and, as I describe in my book, The Fault in Our Stars, for the logic of capitalist production. Chakravarti and Lincoln Wright, emphasizing the message, don't panic, puts the cart before the horse unless tangible measures are being taken to prevent panic-worthy outcomes. And indeed, these repeated assurances against panic have arguably also preempted a more vigorous and urgent public health response, as well as perversely increasing public acceptance of the risk posed by coronavirus infection and the unchecked transmission of the virus. They continue, this moral calm, a sort of manufactured consent, impedes risk mitigation by promoting the underestimation of a threat. Soothing public messaging during disasters can often lead to an increased death toll. Tragically, false reassurance contributed to mortality in both attacks on the World Trade Center and the sinking of the Titanic. Citing the multiple and extended outbreaks of the Black Plague, they remark, pandemics are impervious to ratings. They cannot be canceled or publicly shamed, end quote. And yet, as we've described here on COVID this week previously, hundreds of infectious disease researchers continue to gather mask lists to talk about research on the virus circulating right there in the auditorium. So here's the Infectious Disease Society of America conference a couple weeks ago. Acting as a consultant to Delta Airlines Society's previous president, Carlos Del Rio, still of the IDSA's board of directors, co-wrote the infamous letter to CDC demanding it roll back recommendations for quarantining COVID patients from 10 days to 5. Halloween is every day now, with both the weird, strange things that shouldn't be there mixing with the eerie, everyday things missing. Hospitals across the global north aren't just pretending that COVID isn't here. In the case of this British Columbia hospital, because of the negative connotations, bad vibes, man, but also, as we've reported here, rolling back infectious control measures for all diseases in clinical settings. To the point, as described here for the Brits, sick medical staff are to be written up unless they come into work to place patients and colleagues at risk of new infection. The ghost is found in other machines. Musicians who get sick from COVID aren't allowed to admit it. Otherwise, their concert insurance won't cover the cancellation. Billboard reports that, quote, artists who carry cancellation insurance are generally covered when they come down with health problems. But every show cancellation policy excludes COVID-related cancellations. Artists who cancel from COVID must eat their own expenses and lost revenue, while artists who reschedule generally negotiate with the promoter to waive or absorb the promoter's extra costs. Why? Reporter Chris Turnbull argues that insurers aren't insane. Quote, they want to make money. If they insure these guaranteed super spreader events for a highly infectious, mass disabling killer disease, then they go bankrupt within a few days. And here, Turnbull gets at the core of the matters. Because of the fact COVID denialism is inbuilt into the financial structure itself, it then perpetuates the delusion that COVID isn't the real cause of the mass disablement of these performers, even though we all know the truth, end quote. The fish rots from the head, as Chakravarty and Lincoln sum up, quote, a pandemic is a public health crisis, not a public relations crisis. Conflating the spread of a disease with the way people feel about responding to that disease is deeply illogical. Yet a great deal of the Biden administration's management of COVID-19 has rested on this confusion. Joe Biden amplified this mistaken perspective last September when he noted that the pandemic was over, and then backed that claim by stating, if you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape. The presence or absence of health behaviors reveals a little about a threat to health itself, of course, and a decline in mask use has been shaped in part by the Biden administration's waning support for masking, end quote. If, as Turnbull continues, the refusal to insure musicians speaks to the zombie nature of not only the concert industry, but also the travel sector, perhaps the required public health interventions will be pursued if for greed alone. But the logic of fantasy, or what Chakravarty and Lincoln more specifically diagnosed as the fallacy of moral calm, is a powerful cultural compulsion to fix. Despite the millions of Americans continuing to be lost to the long COVID whirlpool, the benefits of long COVID research for only $1 billion a year compared to the $3 trillion in economic costs of COVID, as Lisa McCorkle and Michael Peluso argue in Nature, aren't impetus enough for a short-sighted ruling class dead set on the status quo that caused this disaster in the first place. But the health, wealth, and well-being of millions of working Americans seems to be a price the employer class is willing to pay. A new study by the Workers' Compensation Research Institute reports 6% of all workers' compensation claims filed earlier in the pandemic from March 2020 to March 2022 are long COVID cases. As states are differing in how they handle long COVID, many of the filed claims across the patchwork system aren't being accepted. Workers' compensation guarantees coverage to all employees harmed at work, Medscape reports, but often requires an employee to prove they were injured or sickened on the job. That can be difficult to determine with an infectious disease or a chronic condition like long COVID, end quote. So another way COVID is being treated as a ghost of an illness. From individual cases to global surveillance. One expects that a major disaster would lead to shoring up programs against such disasters, if only in the specific case. But we appear to be suffering a reverse. ProMed, which for decades has collated popular and professional alerts of new outbreaks from around the world, appeared near collapse this summer. The organization's finances were in disarray, and ProMed staff, never informed of the threat, weren't getting paid. From individual cases to legislation for blocking public health during an ongoing pandemic. Newly elected Trumpist Senator J.D. Vance successfully amended a military budget bill to ban any airline or public transit system nationwide from using Department of Transportation funding if it pursued a mask mandate on its vehicles, quote, in response to COVID-19. Now that implies these good senators are admitting COVID-19 still exists. Democrats are interpreting the bill to apply only to surface transit, buses and trains. Waving the white flag of a defeat the Senate helped bring about by failing and continuing to fail to act against COVID, Vance declared COVID will be with us for the rest of our lives, and there should not be a never-ending cycle of public health panic that surrounds it. In other words, a BSL-3 level virus for which lab technicians mask in full PPE and respirators with unidirectional ventilation and in a biosafety cabinet when they study it should be free to spread. Perhaps it was the virus Vance was talking about when he called the bill a massive victory for personal freedom. Now, among the senators who voted in favor of the bill are these 10 Democrats, including Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who suffers from long COVID. Even being badly sick from COVID isn't enough to act to keep fellow Americans from getting ill too. Keeping his contributors' capital circulating seems to be more important. But claims of no funding for our very health and lives don't cross over into funding for war. Fed Chair Janet Yellen casually insisted that absolutely the US has enough money to cover both Israel and the Ukraine in their respective wars, including the important work of turning the concentration camp of Gaza into rubble, part of a long history of denying the Palestinians the basics in public health, including more recently, COVID vaccines. The key question from apartheid to COVID has degenerated into who counts as human enough? What dehumanization driving rightist politics around the world has leaked into the liberal left. Here in the US, from New York City's treatment of immigrants and the homeless to San Francisco's proposal to drug test welfare recipients. But these politics are efforts to punish the symptoms of a system externalizing the end of its cycle of accumulation upon the poor and the working class. The rich are cashing out of empire, including the very basics of the public commons, with the damage to be imprinted upon the American people. Here we see the top causes of death by age, starting from the top left, ages 1 to 17, 18 to 44, 45 to 64, and 65 and older for two time periods, 2001 to 2002, and 2020 to 2021. We see the youngest across the US states going from largely deaths from transport accidents, there in green, to, by 2021, suicides in pink, homicides in magenta, and cancer in blue. In young adults, transport cancer and cardiovascular diseases in dark blue turn to suicide and fentanyl in light purple. For the 45 to 65-year-olds, cardiovascular deaths surged. There are likely a number of causes for those deaths, including COVID infections themselves. But clearly, suicide, homicide, fentanyl, and cardiovascular from youth to the middle age are markers of both the much commented on decline in US life expectancy, but also the underlying social collapse that the Biden administration is papering over in economic happy talk, as if the wealth for a relatively few, largely found in appreciating homes and investments and stocks and property for the rich, covers people whose wages continue to be eaten by inflation that, while no longer increasing, still props up high prices, forcing people making even $70,000 a year to live out of their own cars. Have you noticed how little in groceries your money pays for, even with inflation now flat? All during an ostensible post-pandemic recovery. The so-called big victory that Americans dedicated just 13% of their incomes to paying off debt in 2022, the lowest percentage since 1989 when the Fed began the survey. In other words, dedicating a fifth to a quarter of one's income to servicing debt is the usual order of the day. Indeed, the Unusual Whales website offers a litany of bad news on the underlying fundamentals of the social economy, no macro indicators the political class champions capture. Recently, Unusual Whales reported that Americans outside the wealthiest 20% of the country have run out of extra savings and now have less cash on hand than they did when the pandemic began, per Bloomberg. 67% of those making $50,000 to $100,000 are living paycheck to paycheck, per Bankrate. Americans need to make $114,000 a year to purchase a typical property, the highest income level on record. That's more than 50% above 2020 levels, when $75,000 was needed to afford a home. Gen Z may be left permanently psychologically scarred by high inflation, per Bloomberg. The US housing market is so expensive that incomes would have to spike 55% for it to be considered affordable, per Business Insider. Car owners fall behind on payments at the highest rate on record, per Bloomberg. 64% of Americans would welcome a recession if it meant lower mortgage rates, per USA Today. Fed's Jerome Powell, we know the fiscal path we're on is ultimately unsustainable. Now that is some dark shit there, and largely focused on people with money enough or assets, and not on those of us so poor that rent and food is all we can park our money into, or those in the spreading homeless encampments in cities across America, offering nothing in response to their situation but police evictions. Environmental collapse partners with this social decline. So many awful things are going on at once that little attention was paid to the trains of potable water the Army Corps of Engineers was forced to rail into New Orleans when rising seas polluted a major U.S. city's drinking water. As literature professor Benjamin Balthasar sums up matters, every presidential administration marks in some ways their own national discursive affective tone. For the Biden administration, call it late imperial realism. Yes, what we are doing is wrong. We feel very bad about it. It likely won't work, but catastrophe is just impassively unavoidable. Today, Palestine, yesterday, the pandemic, tomorrow, climate change. End quote. What to do? First and foremost, place the public's well-being first, both in the US and abroad. It's why the People's CDC issued a statement against the continuing bombing of Gaza. The link to the full statement can be found in the video description. It's why the People's CDC is supporting National Nurses United's efforts at blocking CDC attempts to weaken infectious disease protections in hospitals. It's why we encourage you to join your state's still COVIDing social media pages for the latest in local efforts to protect yourselves, your families, and your communities. Even scientists are organizing to fight for new pandemic resources or preserving those still around, including the pro-med staff we talked of earlier. They went on strike against efforts to close down the Outbreak Alert Service. The staff's demands were met for, quote, increased transparency and communication within the organization and developing partnerships with outside organizations to assist with the program's financial problems, end quote. But other demands remained unaddressed. And what was a free service is moving behind a paywall. Classic example of a once scientist-led service suddenly fenced off for profit. Now, even at this terrible moment, however, another world is possible for public health and political order both. But this will take work. Chakravarti and Lincoln lay out the COVID road ahead. Quote, as should now be very clear, we cannot manifest our way to a good outcome. Concrete interventions are required, including improvements in air quality and other measures aimed at limiting spread in public buildings, more research into vaccine boosting strategy, and investments in next-generation prophylactics and treatments. Rather than damping down panic, public health messaging needs to discuss risks honestly and focus on reducing spread. Despite messages to the contrary, our situation remains unstable because the virus continues to evolve rapidly, and vaccines alone cannot slow this evolution. In the early months of the pandemic, Chakravarti and Lincoln conclude, many in the media drew parallels between the public's response to COVID-19 and the well-known stages of grief: denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. The current situation with COVID-19 calls for solutions, not a grieving process that should be hustled along to the final stage of acceptance. End quote. Our work is cut out for us, addressing multiple crises at once, each one related to the other. And that's COVID This Week. You can find all COVID This Week episodes on the People's CDC YouTube channel, and you can learn more about the People's CDC and read this week's COVID weather report at our website, peoplecdc.org.